One Heat Minute Productions presents Guide for the Film Fanatic, the podcast where we invite a guest to pick one movie from Danny Perry's seminal 1986 film reference book and talk to us about that movie. I'm your host, Jason Bailey, and across the mic and across the country from me is my co-host,
Michael Hall.
Our guest today is one of our very favorite writers and one of our very favorite podcasters and one of our very favorite people. She writes the Essential Hung Up Substack newsletter. She is also the co-host of the Wondery podcast, Lemme Say This. She's also written for Vulture, New York Magazine, the New York Times, GQ, and many more. Please welcome the inimitable Hunter Harris. Hey, Hunter.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on. You're a member of the Three-Timer Club now. Like, you've been on all three of our podcasts now. It's a distinguished company.
I'm so honored.
It's like the Five-Timers Club on SNL. You know, you'll have like the smoking jacket and so forth.
Yes, except I'm not Alec Baldwin, unfortunately. Fortunately.
No, I'm going to say fortunately. I hadn't practiced your intro. I wrote it, but I wasn't fully prepared for exactly how much of a middle-aged white man I would sound like when I said, "Let me say this." But I do my best. Congrats on the enormous success of Let Me Say This. It's a terrific show. One of the things that I really dig about it is that it is somehow both inside and welcoming. Like, you and Peyton have the rapport and the chemistry and the shorthand of like IRL friends, and that comes across without alienating like a casual listener. How do you achieve that very tricky balance? And was this something you were worried about going in?
Yes, it was a concern going in. I'm glad that we've kind of I think we've gotten better at it over time. We've been recording the show since May, but piloting it since last February, a year ago.
Shit. Okay.
And so I think it's just a lot of trial and error, but I also feel honestly, because we're just so internet addicted, there are 50 things that happen in an episode that are just such niche internet or even our college references, but they go by quick enough so that if you don't know it, you're okay, moving on. We don't have to know every little bit of this, I don't know, Zoe Kravitz, Channing Tatum lore to talk about how Blink Twice is not a good movie.
Right. One thing that readers and listeners of yours know, and I count myself among both of those, is that when you are interested in something or taken by something, a film, a show, a song, a celebrity, Hunter Harris is all in. And we're going to hear about it, and we're going to have a nuanced conversation about it. You know, we're recording this still fairly early in 2025, so I kind of want a preview of that. What is on Hunter's radar for the year? What do you anticipate being obsessed with in the months to come?
I don't know.
Or do these things just sort of sneak up on you?
I think they sneak up on me. I feel when you try to engineer or plan something, I can never plan for an infatuation. I can never plan for something to really thrill me. And that kind of finding something organically in the moment and thinking oh my gosh, actually that unexpected kind of finder's joy is what I'm always looking for, and what I can never, if I could plan it, oh my gosh, my life would be so much easier, but it would not be as rich and rewarding, I would imagine.
So if we went back to, this time last year, what would have been the Hunter obsession for 2024 that you would not have predicted?
I don't know. I was really into Dune 2. And I did not see
okay.
that. I did not
I
see
would not
myself...
have seen that coming either.
No. And
no.
I liked Dune 1 a decent amount, but something about Dune 2, I was oh my gosh, Austin Butler and Zendaya and Florence Pugh are just operating on a whole other level. And I'm not so moved by those movies, but those performances, I was very oh, it's really hard to find yourself in a movie this big. Hello, Gladiator 2. Sometimes it's not done very well or easily. And I just thought wow. And and that's so I'm not a sci-fi person really. So that's kind of surprising to me. And maybe
you're not a sci-fi person, but you're a movie star person. And those three are fucking movie stars.
Yeah.
You can't hide that under makeup and costume and whatever. That charisma is going to burn through, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, the same way that I was I still can't believe that how much I truly love the Baz Luhrmann Elvis movie. Like, what if everything is turned up to a 10? What if everything is like as loud and as much and as often as it could possibly be? And somehow through all of that, you like have this very meta commentary on like American myth making and like idolatry in such an interesting way.
That's very true. Okay, before we get to the matter at hand, I have to double check. What is the poster that's directly over your shoulder for the non-YouTube audience?
It's The Drowning Pool, the Paul Newman movie where he plays a PI.
Yeah.
And I love this movie. I love this poster. And also Paul Newman, it was like just his 100th birthday. I love Paul Newman. He was like one of my first celebrity crushes.
How old were you when you developed your celebrity crush on Paul Newman under?
Probably like 13 or 14.
There we go. There it is. Welcome to the show. Okay, so what film did you select to discuss today?
We went back and forth about this, and I'm so happy this is where we landed. Carnal Knowledge.
It came at a time when we were all younger.
Don't press so hard.
Since then, we've been through many changes.
What are you so afraid of? Not you.
And one thing that...
What are you so afraid of? Not you. Man, that's great...
We're going to put a pin in that. We're going to talk about
line.
Miss Candace Bergen in this episode.
What kind of man am I?
A real man.
I wouldn't mind giving her something.
Man who inspires worship.
Real question, is it deceptive to put Rita Moreno in the trailer and pretend like she's like in a lot of the movie?
Incredibly. Oh my God.
Dominating or irresistible.
Carnal Knowledge, Jack Nicholson. And
Yeah, but when she shows up, she shows the fuck up. I mean,
No.
doesn't
There's
disappoint when she,
no disputing that. I'm not diminishing her role in the movie. I'm just wondering, do we put that into the trailer? We'll get back to that as well. So Carnal Knowledge was directed by Mr. Mike Nichols, something of a comeback film for him after the failure of his Catch-22 adaptation in 1970. Carnal Knowledge reunited Mike Nichols with producer Joseph Levine, whose Avco Embassy Films distributed his smash The Graduate, which we
Please
discussed
tell me
on-
there's like a whole book or podcast or some way to deep dive on the comparison between this movie and The fucking Graduate. Because, oh my God, there's gotta be at least a solid college course, if not a PhD available in that.
I mean, I would say I could probably steer you towards a friend of the show and previous guest, Mark Harris's Mike Nichols biography might be your best source for insight into that.
Yeah,
There
good
we
call. Good call. Sorry to interrupt, buddy.
No worries. The screenplay for Carnal Knowledge was by the great satirist and cartoonist Jules Feiffer, who passed earlier this year. Just 4 months before Carnal Knowledge was released, the film adaptation of his play Little Murders was released to theaters. That's a film we've discussed in a previous podcast. Feiffer had originally envisioned and even written Carnal Knowledge as a play and gave it to Nichols in that form. Nichols, of course, was first successful as a stage director, and I think this is fascinating, he felt reading that script that it would make for a stronger film. So Feiffer rewrote it into this screenplay. The film's frequent profanity and frank discussions of sexual subject matter made it rather controversial upon its 1971 release. In fact, police in Albany, Georgia, seized the film during its run there and arrested the theater manager for, quote, distributing obscene material, a crime for which he was convicted in March of 1972. That conviction was appealed all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which found in the 1974 Jenkins v. Georgia ruling that, quote, our own viewing of the film satisfies us that Carnal Knowledge could not be found to depict sexual conduct in a patently offensive way, end quote. Avco Embassy savvily re-released the movie to theaters after the SCOTUS ruling. I'm not sure who was on the court at that time, but I do love the image of like just taking them all down to the screening room to sit as the court and watch Carnal Knowledge.
I hope they wore their robes.
I hope so too. All right, Mike, what does Mr. Danny Perry say about Carnal Knowledge in Guide for the Film Fanatic?
You know, I have stopped pre-reading these things because
Good call.
I find them so shocking that it's
call.
just better to like be shocked, in
Sounds
the
good.
moment, right?
Sure,
I'm excited
sure.
now. Wow.
Mr. Perry writes, an in-film of the early 70s when college-age viewers defended its sexual frankness. Indeed, this was a rare film about sex. and argued about its themes. Directed by Mike Nichols and written by Jules Pfeiffer, Black Comedy is about two friends, the sexually aggressive BS artist Jack Nicholson and wimpy, envious Art Garfunkel, and how their attitudes towards sex and women evolve from the late 40s to 1971. They begin as college roommates who exchange sexual confidences, Nicholson lies, and lose their virginity to the same girl, Candice Bergen, then wind up mismatched pals who are both split from their wives. Garfunkel married college sweetheart Bergen. Nicholson was pushed into marriage with live-in lover Anne Margaret. Garfunkel thinks he's found the secret to love with his 18-year-old hippie girlfriend Carol Kane. Nicholson must pay a prostitute, Rita Moreno, to build up his ego in order to get an erection. Just going right fucking for it, Danny Perry. That's what I'm talking about.
That's what happens in the movie.
What we have is the story of men who think of women as the enemy, who can't be treated with sincerity because they're putting on an act themselves in order to trap a man. It's not women who dehumanize and emasculate these men, but their own fear of women, ball breakers, as Nicholson calls them. Many feminist critics thought it was okay for Nichols and Pfeiffer to present these two friends who don't know anything about women as pathetic men, but they objected to the two male filmmakers taking unnecessary swipes at the four women who have affairs with these men. The women are presented in a most unflattering light. The only woman who doesn't put on an act is Anne Margaret, an actress model. Nichols' direction is innovative but very cold. The acting is exceptional. The best scene is the volatile argument between Nicholson and the depressed Anne Margaret, who reveals her desire for marriage. Also memorable is the breakup phone conversation between Nicholson and Bergen, who's very good here, a scene which reveals Nichols' mastery of dialogue scenes. Also with Cynthia O'Neill. That is a very weak ending to this overall quote, I have to say.
You object to the also with? He does...
We could have stabbed that in earlier in the thing, I'm just saying.
He always ends with an also with. It's just usually the movie has more than like 6 people in it, so it doesn't seem so awkward there at the end. But yes.
It's also an interesting comment to say the women are presented in a most unflattering light. That's sort of like, I mean, it's like saying dogs are presented in an unflattering light in Cujo. Like, nobody in this movie is presented in a flattering light. These people are all fucking terrible, right?
That's fair.
Isn't that the point?
I was going to say, I was struck by that because it's like, does anyone come off in this movie like positively?
I don't.
Are you watching this like, oh, I love them?
I wouldn't want to be or be friends with any of them.
No. If I met any of these people at a party, I would like be eyeing the exit as basically within about 4 seconds of the beginning of the conversation.
Phone call fully, like I'm making a phone call. I'm like, oh, sorry, I have a dentist appointment. Like whatever I have to do to get out of the room.
Right. Well, then that I think is a good sort of entry point then to the sort of the first question to ask, Hunter, which is why this film about these spectacularly unpleasant people. Why was this the one that you wanted to talk over?
Okay, so for a couple of reasons, I feel like I hadn't seen this movie in a long time, and I kind of had been on my mind to revisit it. And then I was doing a talk with Justin Kuritzis, the screenwriter of Challengers, and also Luca Guadagnino's Queer. I'm like, Cheer, who am I?
For the record, I would go see Luca Guadagnino's Cheer. I think that could be
same.
Really... I would go. I would be. I would wait for tickets.
And for some reason, I was just thinking about like these kind of like love triangles of Art Garfunkel, Jack Nicholson, and Candice Bergen in Carnal Knowledge, and then Zendaya, Josh O'Connor, and Mike Feist in Challengers. And something about that was like interesting to me. And so I had to rewatch Challengers anyway for this talk that we were doing. And so I decided to watch Carnal Knowledge as well. And it just kind of seemed like, I don't know, something like the college scenes struck me as being very similar about how there's like this kind of super bad quality to the way, like very Judd Apatow, to like the way that these boys talk about women, where they are very afraid of them, but are also like using the women as a way, and like talking about sex as a way to get closer to each other and try to access some kind of like togetherness that I found really kind of fascinating. And also like, I guess growing up, like when I was in high school and college, I was so like, what do boys talk about? Like what goes on in their heads? And this movie is like the dumbest, but honestly, probably most honest answer, which is like they're always talking about girls, how to
Yes.
sleep with girls, how to kiss girls,
Yep.
what did the girl do with you, all of that stuff. And something about that like competition that really extends into like their adulthood, I thought was like such a kind of weirdly like upsetting, but also kind of hilarious. Like, oh wow, you guys are actually as stupid as I think.
It's a fair assessment. It's a super fair assessment. You mentioned that, of course, that this was a revisit. So do you recall your personal history with this, like when this movie would have first made its way to you and sort of what your initial impressions were?
I guess I went through a real like Mike Nichols phase around the time that I moved to New York, and that was like 8 or 9 years ago. And I don't know if you guys remember, but one of my other favorite movies is Closer, the Mike Nichols movie from 2004.
Oh, yes.
And it's so
yes.
funny to compare. Like, this feels like, in some ways, like not first draft, that sounds like derogatory, but like an early draft of that movie where you're watching people who are very cold and the camera also observes them very dispassionately. There's like a hardness to their interactions with one another, and a harshness to like this kind of web of deceit and lies and cheating, which happens in this movie, but just the way that like the remove with which they talk about relationships and talk about like their emotions, I just find like really kind of fascinating. And also like the cleverness in this script. Like there are so many notes that I made of like lines that I was so like, oh, I love that. Like, oh my gosh. Candice Bergen says to Art Garfunkel, don't you behave differently with other people? And he says, no. And she's like, well, what about with your family? And he's like, oh, I'm sorry, I thought you meant different people. Like those kind of like just slights, like verbal sleights of hands, I just find like I wish I were like an extremely beautiful, clever woman like Candice Bergen, and she is so just transfixing in this movie in a way that I really like.
Yeah, I mean, that was, first of all, her character and the dimensions of that character were something that really struck me on this viewing. This was probably only my second time seeing it. I only saw it for the first time a few years ago. It was just one I'd always kind of meant to make my way to and hadn't. Is that there is a sort of like a subgenre of, I think the easiest way to define them would be like Men Are Pigs movies, you know, things like a lot of like early Neil LaBute. I would say Hurley Burley falls into that, some early David Mamet stuff, Sexual Perversity in Chicago, so forth. What I think is sort of separates this from a lot of those is that it's not just a Men Are Pigs movie, in that like Sandy, the Candice Bergen character, is not some like doe-eyed victim who is like taken advantage of by these two. This is a woman who like knows the score and knows what Nicholson is up to from the second that he calls her that time. And walks into this fully aware of exactly what this situation is. So, and by the same token, every woman in this movie is working some kind of angle, not as sort of explicitly, I think, or as sort of gross as Nicholson and Art Garfunkel's characters are, but they understand this dynamic, except as he noted, for maybe the Anne Margaret character, who has a sort of purity that kind of destroys her. The other thing that I think is really, you know, I watched it like right after Jules Pfeiffer had passed, so I paid more attention to the screenplay this time as well. And I think the structure of it is kind of brilliant in that you can tell the stage origins because it has like a 3-act structure. You know what I mean? Like that first act that is basically the love triangle piece of it that you're talking about. But then once that section concludes, we don't see Candice Bergen again for the rest of the movie. Like she marries Art Garfunkel. She is referenced, but she is not seen again. So it's almost like that's sort of a self-contained piece. Then the middle piece being the Anne Margaret piece, and then sort of the third act being the kind of ugly epilogue there. So what I think is fascinating is the way that the relationship between the two of them, the two men, changes in each of those acts, but also fundamentally doesn't change. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, no, 100%. Because there's still like that edge of competition between them, but then it's almost like not like true clear reversal, but you can feel Jack Nicholson getting smaller. Like he kind of compresses in some of these scenes as he's like maybe becoming not so much insecure, but like less certain. And then Art Garfunkel kind of getting a little bit cockier, a little bit more obnoxious. And the way that like their relationship kind of expands and contracts is really interesting to me. But at the same time, there is always kind of the sly edge of like, they're both trying to get laid in every single scene. And they're both trying to figure out like, what if it's possible for you just to be like a little bit happier? I'm going to take that chance every single time.
Right.
Yeah. And that kind of like similarity to each other, I just thought is like, it's so weird and funny and kind of like fucked up and bad and also like a kind of uncomfortable. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't stay in a man's mind for this long. It's like disgust. It's like gross to me. Like
it
you
is.
need a broom.
It is. Well, and it is especially that in that first section, in sort of the first act, if you will, because of the really pointed way and smart way that Pfeiffer and Nichols are doing counterpoint and commentary. In terms of like, we see a scene between Art Garfunkel and Candice Bergen, and then we see a scene where Art Garfunkel is telling Jack Nicholson about what happened between him and Candice Bergen in the scene we just saw. And we see the ways and the choices he makes in terms of when he's going to tell the truth and when he's going to fabricate things. And we see how Nicholson's reactions to the things that he says will affect their next interaction. And the way that it's sort of, God, I almost said the way it almost ping pongs back and forth, but I guess if we're going to make the Challengers comparison, it's a tennis match back and forth between the two of them. So I found that sort of the conversation that's happening between what we see and how it's described to be especially fascinating in those scenes.
That's a good example of how, like, as you pointed out, it is how dudes talk to each other, especially, I mean, no, I'm not even going to say especially the early stuff, but like, it's both the worst version of that and also maybe the most honest of any like sort of film depiction I've seen of it, because like the way that they lie to each other and the way that those lies evolve through their age is an incredible thing to sort of see, because I have observed all of those things. I would like to say I haven't observed myself saying all of those things, but I've at least been a part of conversations where all of those things, where I watched dudes go through all of those sort of processes. And like, maybe you just can't get a divorce without adding some new awful vocabulary to your language. Maybe it's just not possible. I don't know. I have not seen a dude go through it and manage to like maintain his vocabulary.
Yeah.
So, wait, I love that. That's so funny. But that's like, what an astute observation.
This movie like just is so uncomfortable in so many places, but that's because it's right and it's done well.
I was going to say there is a way that it kind of like doesn't pull away from the like intense discomfort of these two like really desperate people that I think is like, I don't know, almost feels like very European. It feels very like not, there's no sort of vanity or pretense, but then it also is all vanity and pretense. Like I kind of am really into the idea of like these two really close friends having this like one essential secret between them and like never discussing it, talking around it constantly. And you almost wonder like how just as like as kind of glaring and garish as their like discussions are with each other, there's almost double that not being said between them, which I think is really fascinating.
That is. And the other thing too is that, and it's not just that, you know, these sort of unspoken and ugly things between them become so sort of all encompassing. The interactions between the Nicholson and Candice Bergen characters get so curdled. It gets so ugly between them, and then it starts to get ugly between her and Art Garfunkel too. And at a certain point, the question becomes, what is in this for anyone anymore? But it has become a point of contention and competition between these two men that now to end what is clearly like not a healthy or enjoyable relationship is unthinkable, because that would mean that the other one won.
One of my favorite scenes in like that first kind of chapter when they're at college is when Jack Nicholson like corners Candice Bergen, and he's like, well, he tells me, you tell him his thoughts. Why don't you tell me my thoughts? Like, what am I thinking? Why can't you do that with me? And that kind of like, whatever you're doing with him, do with me. It's so like, what a like didactic and obvious way to think about a relationship. Like, it's such a like false equivalence, obviously, but like you can only think like that when you're truly like 21 years old. Like,
yes,
it's just so funny and so weird and crazy. But you can see how that extends kind of into the Anne Margaret relationship, like in the second chapter, where he is still seeing this relationship in such like black and white kind of unforgiving terms that make it impossible. It's like, oh, no wonder you're feeling so unfulfilled, because you literally cannot even like extend any, not even like grace, just like sensitivity to anyone else, or like you're so locked in your own perspective.
Absolutely.
Well, and can't and is still in this thing of like, it's your fault I'm dissatisfied with my fucking, you know, the fact of my complicated consciousness, right? It's your fault that I'm scared of dying, but I don't know, I don't have any of the language to sort of talk about that. So it's your fault.
Yeah.
Oh, and you're talking about this thing about this unspoken truth. The fucking balls and cruelty of that end scene where he's going through the slides of the girls he slept with, and as a viewer, you're just like, is he gonna do it? Is he gonna say it? Is he like that? For like, I mean, that shit had like slasher movie tension for three people sitting in a room, like drinking whiskey and only one of them talking. That scene was just, had
but also
my
like the
heart rate up.
The production design there, that was like something out of American Psycho. Like it just felt so like severe, like all the glass. The fact that like you can see kind of all like the glow of the lights outside, and it's like there's so much going on outside of this world, and yet in here it's like so much like emotional negligence. Like it's so cold and like weirdly
angular.
Yeah, it just it's really like, oh my god. And then the fact that like a slide of his daughter is like in the middle of it, it's like, oh my god, this is this is actually crazy town.
Yeah. No, Mike, I'm glad you brought that up, because like, again, this was a second viewing, but I had forgotten, I couldn't remember as the scene is unfolding how that went. And so when it came up, I literally gasped. I gasped out loud, like with no one else in the room. I'm just like audibly gasping because of a slide that comes on and then disappears, which I think gets at the heart of what for me is shocking about the movie, which is not it's not specific vocabulary choices. It's not the frankness of the conversation or the subject matter or any of that. What hits me so hard whenever I watch this movie is the sheer emotional brutality of it. The way in which people who are supposed to care about each other will mercilessly hurt each other, will go at each other's soft spots. And that's why one of the things that I think Perry absolutely nails is that, the Nicholson Margaret knockdown, drag out fight is one of the most emotionally brutal things I've maybe ever seen in a movie. Like the exchanges in that scene, it got you hot. Something has to, you have such contempt for me, kid, you earned it. Like that is hard to watch, hard to listen to, hard to imagine talking to someone you ever cared about in those kind of terms.
Also, when she says, I want to get married, it's like, again, to make another like weird horror movie, it's like, don't walk that way. No, what are you doing? That's not the solution to any problems here. Don't go in that fucking cabin. Don't get married to this man. Are you out of your mind?
Yes.
I don't know what else to compare it to but a slasher movie. And that's a weird thing to say about a Mike Nichols. You know what I mean? That's a weird comparison, but I don't have anything better.
No, that's very true. I also just, sorry to go back to that scene very quickly. There is something about like Anne Margaret, never leaving the bedroom and like existing only like in this like one space, which is so tragic. But then at the same time, I also love that Mike Nichols, like people are always eating in bed in his movies. Like that's such a setting for, I mean, hello, the breakfast carbonara and heartburn.
Oh God, I've never noticed this.
There's a scene in The Graduate too with like some kind of eating in bed, but like all of the, I don't know, it's like such a funny, as much as like these scenes are so raw, those like still kind of stylistic through lines, I just find like really cool and fascinating.
That is the other thing that I really appreciate about this. I realize, you have to set it in period because it's over a long portion of time, and they have to age into their eventual ages. And by the way, I know people looked older then, but I don't buy those two as college students like for a half of a second. But it's fine. It's fine. It's like if we were watching a play, you sort of like grant the premise. But what I think works out so nicely is that, especially those college scenes, you're dealing with like period music and setting of like, the 40s. So we're like subverting these ideas of like, oh, this was an innocent time. Like this, kids today on the internet, they learn all this, vulgarity so early, and they're watching porn on their phones or whatever, as if like everybody was, a goody two shoes back in the 40s and the 1950s. And, this period that we look at through these rose colored glasses. And I think that's a deliberate choice to sort of to take that idea and turn it upside down. I think
visually
really
too, like when we were talking about that last scene in his apartment and everything, like it could not be more different than from Amherst,
right?
If you were, can you imagine if like, I don't know, all of a sudden, what was that Giamatti movie where he's in college recently? Holdovers? Can you imagine if all of a sudden there's like at the end of the movie, there's a scene in Dubai? What the fuck is, what are we doing here? I mean, right? Like that, it's just visually that whole thing. It's also, I never went to an Ivy League school or whatever, but like we've been sort of fed that image and the mythology of what that is. I mean, our whole American lives.
I'd also kind of forgotten that the college scenes were so early, like set so early, until I was watching, and they're like kind of at that like jukebox like dance, like a bar or something, and like they're dancing so formally. I was like, oh wait, wow, like the music is so different. But I also, that's one of my favorite scenes in the movie, when it's just like that kind of long uninterrupted take of Candice Bergen laughing like hysterically between these two men, which is both like so incredibly awkward, because we know what kind of they are still trying to figure out between the three of them. But then she looks so beautiful, and she's so like, you can see exactly what they see in her and exactly why she is so inherently resistant to being just some plaything between the two of them.
Yes. God, I am so glad that you brought that up, because that was a note that I made. I was really struck by the choices Nichols is making in terms of coverage in this. And we talked about this actually a little bit with Mark Harris when he was on the last show, talking about The Graduate, that you can really tell that he's a stage director in that movie, because so much of it is playing out in like medium wides, like so much is sort of in frame blocking, and that's stage background. Like you learn how to rearrange a frame that people are just locked in on, and then, to make that picture more interesting. I think, when you put these two films next to each other, you do really see growth in terms of what he's discovering about what a camera can do and what a close-up can do. And there are specifically like 2 or 3 different points in this where he is not doing conventional coverage, where he's not doing, chop, 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 edit, close up, two people talking, cutting back and forth between them. That is one of them. And that notion of keeping the camera on someone while they're either just listening or while they're talking with someone but not cutting away is...
You love that shit, bro. Every
I
time
do.
somebody does that in a movie, you love that
crazy.
shit.
We talked about it when Charlie Taylor was on the Godard film that he was on there, and that jumped out at me when he kept the camera on her during the double date. When he kept the camera.
What's that movie with Clooney in the cab? Fucking Michael Clayton.
Michael Clayton.
You love
baby.
that shit.
That's right. That's right. When he keeps the camera on Nicholson while Bergen and Garfunkel are bickering about camping. And then also his choices about direct to camera, which is a bold and risky ass choice to make, especially if it's not like sort of part of the visual playbook that you've established early in a movie. And the fact that like we're at the midpoint, I think, when Nicholson goes direct to camera to confess his dysfunction, to confess his like erectile dysfunction, basically. And the fact that he plays that in not only a long close-up, but a direct-to-camera confessional close-up, and then comes back to it at the very end, and has both him and Rita Moreno doing that last scene direct-to-camera. Like, this is a filmmaker who is giving a lot of thought to these kinds of choices, to how he's going to frame things, to how he's going to cover things, to how these scenes are going to get edited once it comes to that point. And I was just sort of flabbergasted by that stuff this time around.
Yeah, I think there's something really like, again, it adds that sense of like, discomfort about like hearing these really emotionally vulnerable, naked things. I feel like Art Garfunkel's thing is more about him feeling like he feels relatively satisfied now, but like kind of still has like that kind of insatiable hunger for like new sexual experiences. And we get a sense of like both their like what they know about each other, their relationship, but then it, I don't know, just like adds to a sense of like intimate remove that this movie does and glides along the entire way, where it's like you're both so close and like entire continents away from what they're actually thinking and feeling and doing, which makes it into kind of an unreliable narrator where I don't, because I'm seeing people lie so constantly, I like don't know who or what to trust.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And to that end, I feel like that's why, like every time I watch this movie, I forget that it ends with the Rita Moreno scene. Like I forget that she's in it. I forget that that's how it ends. And then it gets there and I'm reminded that that's perfect. That it's an absolutely perfect ending. And like to have Oscar winner by this time, Rita Moreno, of like in your movie, and to save her for that last scene, like to make that
where she doesn't really have that much on-screen dialogue. There's not, I mean, like she talks a lot, but it's not dialogue, which is weird. You know what I mean? It's like she's performing she's like an actor who's acting someone who's acting. Right? Like she's playing a person who's playing a part. It's a weird.
Yes.
And I think that's one of those things that's got to be incredibly hard to do believably.
Yeah. There's something about the Jack Nicholson character in this where he seems to like choose or be extra attracted to like a woman who is famous or kind of playing a part. Like Anne Margaret was like in an like airline commercial, I think he says. There's like that woman that they see who she was like a newscaster or something like that when they're like at the ice skating ring kind of halfway through. And then this kind of like meta feeling Rita Moreno casting. It's like, I don't know. It adds to kind of the like, I need to prove that this woman is valuable by everyone else's definition, which is kind of what Art Garfunkel is doing in the beginning of the movie when he needs his friend to be like, oh yeah, she's hot, you should go for her. And that comes back around that he needs like this kind of external validation that's like really, really, so like fucked up, but like also very like, what great character work of kind of laying that foundation of someone who is ultimately very insecure, but then of course like ends with this kind of like funny, really crazy release at the end of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Look, I know it's not a popular opinion to have right now, or for most of my life, but there was something real to the way that people understood. I don't even know if they were reading Freud necessarily, but just the way that sort of Freudian analysis was just a part of the just drinking water, and everybody just sort of knew about it. And like there's a point at which obviously it sort of got over. Every cigar was, wasn't a cigar or whatever, right? There was a sort of a point where it sort of got out of hand, but at the point where this movie's being made. Yeah. A serious artist like Mike Nichols has been just bathing in this, marinating in this stuff his whole intellectual life. The idea that we are motivated by sort of sexual desires that are in some way sort of founded in something that happened when we were a kid, things that we don't even completely understand. This idea is, I think, present in a lot of great movies from this era, and we just we don't talk that way anymore. We don't sort of approach each other that way anymore. And I think that we have a sort of credulity to each other's stated motivations that they just would have considered naive and ridiculous at that point. And I think they are right. I think that, the sort of Instagram versions of ourselves, like, it's actually like way more interesting to talk about why somebody posted a particular photo than to talk about the photo. What are they trying to represent in this photo or in this sort of series of photos is way more interesting than the photos themselves, and actually tells you a lot more about the person. But that's not how the fuck we talk about it anytime ever. They're just like, oh, they just wanted to show this picture of their lunch. Whatever the fuck. Like, we don't analyze that stuff at all. And somebody who is a serious artist like a Mike Nichols or even a Jack Nicholson, I don't know that I'm going to give Art Garfunkel that much credit, but like I think he just wanted to like be like famous and for something else that didn't involve Paul Simon or whatever, right? But like somebody, if you're making the kind of movies that these guys are making, this is a thing that you're fucking actively thinking and talking about, and it's all over. This movie, this movie is completely soaked in it. And I think it benefits from it, and movies in general at the time benefited from it. Unfortunately, all the shit got hijacked by Hugh Hefner and got turned into some fucking weird thing that none of us wanted anyway. Elon Musked the situation. But we kind of like threw out the baby with the bathwater on it, in my opinion.
I think you've totally hit upon what I think is like so fascinating about this movie, is that it's so much about how these people like present their own desires or also try to like undermine them or almost like restrict them in some way, that it ends up being like entirely revealing of everyone's, maybe not everyone's, but most people's in this movie's worst self. But laying that all bare, and when you don't think you're doing that, it's like so emotionally like naked. It's like they have no skin on and think that they are walking around fully clothed. And that's something that I think is like really from like scene one, you're watching people try to conceal something that is so obvious to us as viewers, which I think is really what a fascinating kind of tension.
Beautifully said. All right, friends, let's talk about the release and reception of Carnal Knowledge, which opened in New York on June 30th, 1971. That week's other new releases included Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. There's a double feature for you. The $1 Million Duck, and just 5 days earlier, Clute. That is a good double feature right there.
Oh, wow.
Fucking shout out to Clute. Yeah, that'd be a good weekend to go to the movies. Also in theaters that week, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Love Story, Walkabout, Shaft, Willard, Ryan's Daughter, Death in Venice, The Anderson Tapes, and a re-release of Lawrence of Arabia. Mike, what were the news headlines on that day?
Wednesday, June 30, 1971, 3 Soviet astronauts were found dead in their Soyuz 11 spaceship. They had been on the Salyut experiment station for 24 days, at that point the longest any humans had survived off-planet. frankly, a scientific miracle in 1971. Then they got in their little can and they shot off back to Kazakhstan, but all three were dead when the can was recovered.
Shit.
At that point, nobody knew what happened to them. So this is a thing we haven't really decided for this show. Do I say what happened to them? Or do we stick to what people knew on June 30th, 1971? Because at the time, they didn't know why these guys died. I think we leave it alone. If you want to know more,
Google.
That's not what you come to this show for. So
it feels kind of retro to leave it in the air, to let us kind of find it ourselves.
Yeah. If you can get Google to fucking work, then look there for it.
So in light of that, mob boss Joe Colombo was in a coma at Roosevelt Hospital after being shot in the face at a Unity Day rally in Columbus Circle held by the Italian American Civil Rights League. All of this sounds fake now, like I'm reporting a scene from The Godfather as fact, but I swear it's all true. Colombo was shot by Jerome A. Johnson, a 24-year-old black man who was promptly executed on the spot.
Wow.
And I'm not going to tell you what happened to Joe Colombo because he was in a coma on June 30th, 1971. If you want to know more, you can find out. We know what the fuck happened to Jerome A. Johnson, though.
We do. We do.
Yeah. And he had to know. You don't shoot Joe Colombo in the face at fucking Columbus Circle and think you're going to go home.
You don't.
What, are you going to go to the subway?
Columbus Circle is a crazy place to kill someone.
Right? I mean, he had to know. Anyway.
Yeah.
And finally, in a story that should be part of our shared American mythology, on June 30th, 1971, Alaska Senator Mike Gravel. It's spelled like gravel, but I've heard most people pronounce it as Gravel. I don't know which is correct. I'm going to go with Gravel. I think people liked fancy Frenchified pronunciations in 71. Sure. His grandkids probably go by Gravel. But he tried to read the Pentagon Papers on the Senate floor. You know about the Pentagon Papers, right?
Oh, yeah.
Again, that's not what this show is for, but this is a really big deal. When the other senators didn't want to listen and so denied him a quorum, Gravel went across the street to the hearing room of the Buildings and Grounds Subcommittee of the Public Works Committee, of which he was the chair, and he sat there and he read the Pentagon Papers to reporters for 3 hours. Now, what did the Pentagon Papers have to do with the Buildings and Grounds Subcommittee of the Public Works Committee? I don't have any fucking idea. I'm not sure anyone ever followed up on that question. The point is that Mike Gravel couldn't be stopped in his fight to hold the U.S. government accountable, and I wish we had a few fucking senators now who were paying a little bit more attention to this story. Shout out to Mike Gravel.
I was going to say, wait, where is that energy? We need that today. We need that tomorrow.
Please.
I mean, he's in the public works bullshit, whatever the fuck, it doesn't matter. It was the one room on that whole block where he could tell the guys to keep the lights on, right? And so the janitors are sitting outside fuck, I'm sure. But there's a room full of reporters. There's nobody else in there. But that's sometimes what has to be done. All right, this is not what this show is for. Jason, what did critics have to say about Carnal Knowledge?
In the New York Times, Vincent Canby raved, "In recent years, having sat through so many 2-hour-plus films that had nothing on their minds, I found myself quite anxious to remain seated for more than the 96 minutes that Mike Nichols, the director, and Jules Feiffer, the writer, had allotted for their film. For Carnal Knowledge has a great deal on its mind, being in effect a political and social history of this country during the last 30 years, as defined exclusively in the sexual triumphs, adjustments, and disasters of two middle-class American nebbishes." In the Village Voice,
Canby's coming off great in this show. I'm pretty much every episode, Canby's nailing it, I have to say.
Yeah. In the Village Voice, Andrew Saris, no slouch himself, opined, "Mike Nichols and Jules Feiffer have collaborated on what might be described as satirical structuralism, in that they slice away all but the sexual dimensions of two American males, carting their increasingly insecure penises from the 40s, Glenn Miller and the Fountainhead and such, through the 60s, Ball Breakers and Flower People and such. Jack Nicholson plays the satyr to Arthur Garfunkel's schmuck, but the plot twists and turns sufficiently to avoid the perils of excessive schematization. But, there's always a but, in Time, Stephen Canfor wrote, "Clearly, scenarist Jules Feiffer and director Mike Nichols had more than facile satire in mind. Judging by Feiffer's acidulous cartoons and Nichols' previous work, they are men with considerable powers of observation. But in Carnal Knowledge, their vision is scan deep. Save at the beginning, men and women address one another and are treated as mere organs. Coupling is viewed with righteous distaste. Sex, though essentially joyless as practiced by these characters, must be followed by punishment. The film does glitter with explicit wit, but far too often is reduced to attitudes posing as people, glimpses pretending to be insights.
Bro, you could have just said I didn't get it. You didn't have to write all that. You did a lot of extra work just to say that you missed the fucking point.
And in The New Yorker,
Pauline
Kael called it a grimly purposeful satire about depersonalization and how we use each other sexually as objects. And in Mike Nichols' cold, slick style, it is like a neon sign that spells out the soullessness of neon. This movie doesn't just raise a problem, it's part of it. And aesthetically, it makes the problem worse. She further wrote, it's all surface and whacking emphasis. The controlled hysteria of this desperate, surefire, hit-it-on-the-button comedy style has about the same relationship to humor that belting has to singing. So,
did she just see like comedy on the poster and believed it? What about this is a comedy?
We'll have to table that for now. How did it do in terms of box office and awards, Mike?
I know some people found the Comeback Kid funny, but I don't know if that was the fucking point, right? All right, yeah. Carnal Knowledge cost $5 million, and $1 million of that went to Nichols. You know what?
Good for him.
And returned that investment nicely with $12.3 million in rentals in the U.S. and Canada. It only got one Oscar nomination, Best Supporting Actress for Anne Margaret, well-deserved, which she lost to Cloris Leachman for The Last Picture Show. She was also a runner-up for that prize at the New York Film Critics Circle, but she won it at the Golden Globes. The Globes also nominated Jack Nicholson for Best Actor and Art Garfunkel for Best Supporting Actor, and Jules Pfeiffer was nominated for Best Original Screenplay Comedy at the WGA Awards.
I'm sorry, right. Art Garfunkel getting a Best Supporting Actor nomination. My big five-headed brother, but like that's so crazy.
Somebody was trying to get him to like play at their kid's birthday or bat mitzvah or something, and was like, "Look, I'll get you this fucking right. Come on, you show up. It's Long Island."
I mean, stranger things have happened with the Globes. That's all we'll say about that.
True. Okay, fair.
Hunter, I do appreciate. We almost made it through the hour without a forehead reference. All right, now it's time for a segment we call Double It Up, where we each select one movie that we think would make an ideal double feature with today's focal film. Hunter Harris, you're our guest, which means you go first, but you've already tipped your hand on this. Challengers is your pick, yes?
Yes. And now that I'm thinking about it after our conversation, I guess the part that I, think that it's like a very good marriage between these two movies is that they're both about like male friendships over several years, over like a long period of time. And that's kind of an aspect of this that I think is really interesting because especially in Challengers, the rhythm of like the way that these two boys talk to one another changes as like their friendship kind of ebbs and flows as they get closer and further away from Zendaya, as they get closer and further away from like tennis and like the relationship to kind of winning and losing. And with Carnal Knowledge too, you can kind of see that like as Art Garfunkel feels like more successful, he gets more obnoxious and also less kind of needy, but more like desirous, and the kind of opposite happens with Jack Nicholson, and that like just the script, I think that's so well done.
Yeah, I would also note that there is a tennis scene in Carnal Knowledge,
of course,
where in something of a direct opposite to the kinetic camera work of the tennis stuff in Challengers, we don't even see the tennis. We don't see the tennis ball. That's another, I think, inspired coverage choice where he stays on the two women who are watching them play tennis. Hunter, you also, because you're so insightful, mentioned my Double It Up pick earlier in our conversation. It's I think, a pretty sensible one. I picked Closer, which, as you mentioned, is This was near the beginning of Nichols' career. Closer was near the end of the career, but a very similar, that one actually literally based on a play. 4 key characters, 2 men, 2 women, and a brutally emotionally brutal, candid, harsh, mean, nasty, often examination of the damage that they are willing to do to each other in the name of sex and in the name of competitiveness and in the name of what they believe to be love. If you'd like to hear Hunter's thoughts on Closer, give a listen to her episode of A Very Good Year, 2004. Mike, what is your pick for Double It Up for this episode?
My pick also starts with a C. Is this like when we all show up to work and we're wearing the same color shirt and pants, even though
Yes.
It's
lovely.
Or is it not even that much of a coincidence?
No,
you know what? I'm going to take a much lighter. I'm going to go easy on people. You two you two want to make everybody think all the time. I'm going to go with Chasing Amy, and I'm going to tell you why.
Okay.
Because that movie, and it may be accidentally, it may be just purely as a result of like dumb, misplaced hubris. But I think that movie actually does a pretty good job of showing how dudes talk to each other about girls in the 90s. And there are actually, like, it's a different scene than the 40s, right? It's a different sort of, like, you know, women were much more sexually empowered, so on and so forth. Like, so there's lots of ways that it is different. But the bullshit, the bullshit artist aspect of it.
Yes.
And what a time for you to have thrown away the whole welcome to the ships at sea thing when you had bullshit artists just handed to you on a silver platter with this episode.
That's true.
But the bullshit artist element of it is still there. And the thing that I've sort of come to appreciate a little bit as an adult about this movie, because I've watched this movie several times as an adult, first to be like, why did I like this movie? And then to be like, why do I still like this movie? I can't exactly, but it's because what's not to like about it is sort of like, you know, the way that they just, it's so weird the way they talk about her being a lesbian. But at some point, if you sort of remove the identity of lesbian from the movie and sort of like to dudes who don't know girls and aren't dating girls, every girl might as well be a lesbian. It's all like, it's one of these things where like, it's sort of like a really easy flag to wave to talk about women as not being available to men.
Sure.
Right. And so like when you do actually have a woman who does actually talk to you and spend time with you and maybe even whatever else you're hoping to accomplish, it feels like sort of a miracle. At that point, it feels like she might as well be a lesbian because I didn't think this was going to happen anyway, right? Which is a weird sort of thing, but I think it's real. So anyway, it's a nice movie. It's much easier to watch than anything else that we've talked about today. He had none of the aspirations of Mike Nichols. He doesn't know anything about Freud. Does not give the first fuck. Dude, talk to me.
I'm going to briefly argue you on one point. I would say that the emotional brutality that we've discussed of like the Nicholson and Margaret scene is not entirely absent from, say, the hockey arena scene of Chasing Amy. Like there's some nastiness happening there. It's not entirely an easy Sunday to swallow, but I see your point.
Also, Joey Lauren-Adams was really good, and she
really
should
was
have gotten to be in more things. When she was his girlfriend, because
100%.
She was really good, and brings a sort of gravitas to that movie that might actually be the thing that saves it. Chasing Amy.
There's a recent documentary, I mean, like last year, called Chasing Amy. It's a documentary by a trans filmmaker who was very inspired to sort of embrace, you know, certain aspects of sexuality and also to become a filmmaker by that movie. And they talked to a lot of the people involved in that movie, including Kevin Smith and Joey Lauren-Adams, about how the conversation on it has evolved. And I found it to be really insightful and fascinating if you have this sort of same interest.
Hell yeah. I'll have to watch that.
Yeah.
Hell yeah.
It's quite
movie.
Good. Hunter, where can people follow you on social media and read your work?
I'm hunterharris.substack.com. I'm on Instagram at hunterh, and I'm still using Twitter like barely at Hunter Y Harris, and I'm on Blue Sky as at hunterh.
There we go. I'm Jason-Bailey on Blue Sky and Letterboxd. Mike, where can people find you?
I am Fifth Column Films on Blue Sky.
And of course, if you like the show and you think other people might like it too, please leave us a rating and or a review on your podcatcher of choice. If you'd like to join our mailing list and get weekly show notes and such, you can do that at buttondown.email/filmfanatic. And if you'd like to make a donation to support us on the show, you can do that at ko-fi.com/funcitysounds. And if you're one of those weirdos who likes to watch videos of people recording a podcast, find us on YouTube at our channel.
Hey, the videos are fun.
They are fun. Mike is having a
fun.
good time, mixing it up, doing some things with it. Mike, lest you forget, you guys, Mike is an honest to God documentary director and editor. So he's not just going to like cut back and forth between people. It's visually dynamic. There's like pictures and shit. It's fun.
Our guests are beautiful and fascinating. I mean, it's the videos are, I didn't know I wasn't sure they were going to be good, but I'm like 3 or 4 in now. I have to say they're pretty good.
Pretty good. So that channel again on YouTube is Danny Perry Rocks.
Our humblest thanks to our guiding light, Mr. Danny Perry, author of Guide for the Film Fanatic, and shout out to executive producer Blake Howard, who I sometimes need to just relax and center me by telling me how powerful and masculine I am. He always comes through.
Thank you again, Hunter.
Thank you so much. This was so fun.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Jason.
And thank you for listening. Join us in 2 weeks when the Czar of Noir himself, the one and only Eddie Moeller, joins us to talk about Michael Curtiz's 1950 film, The Breaking Point. See you then.